In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. The scientist's revelation, science and the Quran. The air was thick with anticipation inside a state-of-the-art research facility in Beijing. A group of the world's top scientists sat in a sleek, high-tech conference room equipped with the latest quantum computers, satellite imaging technology, and advanced research tools. These experts were the leading minds in quantum mechanics, space exploration, and genetics, individuals who dedicated their lives to uncovering the secrets of the universe. Yet today, they were facing an unusual task, one that many of them had never imagined taking part in. At the front of the room stood Professor Li Wei, one of China's most esteemed astronomers. His face was calm but serious as he addressed his colleagues. The government has assigned us an important investigation. There are claims that the Quran, a book written over 1,400 years ago, contains scientific knowledge that was unknown at the time of its revelation. Our duty is to examine these claims using an unbiased scientific approach. A murmur spread through the room. Some of the scientists exchanged doubtful glances. Others tapped their pens on the table, deep in thought. Dr. Eric Xu, a biologist and outspoken atheist, let out a chuckle. Are we really here to use science to validate religious texts? Science and religion have always been separate, at least that's what we've believed. A few scientists nodded in agreement. It was an unspoken rule in the academic world. Faith belonged in places of worship, while science belonged in laboratories and research centers. But not everyone in the room shared the same skepticism. Wang, a physicist of Uyghur descent, leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. I understand the hesitation, but let's not dismiss this too quickly. The Quran does describe certain natural phenomena with remarkable accuracy. Don't you think it's worth investigating? Professor Li nodded, his gaze sweeping across the room. That's exactly why we're here. Are these descriptions just coincidences? Or is there something more to discover? The lights dimmed slightly as the massive screen at the front of the room flickered to life. Projected onto it were several verses from the Quran, passages that spoke of the universe, natural laws, and even human development. The scientists were about to embark on an investigation that none of them could have anticipated. A verse that shook their beliefs. The first verse appeared on the screen in large, bold Arabic script, followed by its translation. Do the unbelievers not realize that the heavens and the earth were once joined together, then we separated them? Quran 21:30. The room fell completely silent. Some of the scientists immediately began flipping through their notes, searching for any familiar scientific theories that mirrored this statement. Others sat back, their expressions unreadable. Dr. Sun, a leading cosmologist specializing in the origins of the universe, leaned forward, his brow furrowed. This sounds eerily similar to the Big Bang theory. It suggests that the heavens and the earth were initially a single entity before being separated. At first, he shook his head, dismissing the thought. He whispered to himself, surely this is just an interpretation, nothing more than a coincidence. But then Professor Li spoke, his voice measured and firm. Let's think about this rationally. The Big Bang theory was only confirmed in the 20th century after scientists discovered cosmic background radiation, but this Quranic verse was revealed more than 1,400 years ago. How could such knowledge exist in an ancient text? A quiet tension filled the air. The skeptical expressions on some of the scientists' faces slowly began to fade, replaced by curiosity, and in some cases something even deeper. Then another verse appeared on the screen. And the heavens we constructed with strength, and indeed we are expanding it. Quran 51:47. This time Dr. Sun's eyes widened in disbelief. This isn't possible. His voice was barely above a whisper. The idea that the universe is expanding wasn't even considered by scientists until the 20th century. Before that, we believed the universe was static. It was only in 1929 that Edwin Hubble's discovery proved that the universe is, in fact, expanding. The words lingered in the air. The scientists sat in stunned silence, exchanging looks of disbelief. One by one, they began to question everything they had been taught. A journey of discovery. What had started as a skeptical inquiry was now turning into something much more profound. Each verse they analyzed seemed to present information that modern science had only recently uncovered. Dr. Chen, one of the most doubtful scientists at the beginning of the meeting, now sat frozen in his seat. His eyes remained locked onto the screen, his mind racing. How could an ancient book contain knowledge that had only been discovered in the last century? His once unwavering belief in pure skepticism was starting to crack. For the first time in his career, he felt something he had never expected: doubt in his own doubt. And as the scientists continued their analysis, they realized one thing: this was only the beginning. Professor Li Wei scanned the room, observing the expressions on his colleagues' faces. He spoke with certainty. So far, we haven't found any inconsistencies in these verses. The knowledge we've only confirmed in recent centuries seems to have been recorded in this book long before modern science even existed. Dr. Eric Xu, who had been skeptical from the start, let out a long sigh. Could this all be a coincidence, or is there something far greater at play here? No one answered right away. The room was filled with silent contemplation. These scientists had entered with the goal of disproving the Quran's scientific claims, but now, for the first time, they were questioning their own beliefs. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. These were professionals, people who had dedicated their lives to science. And yet, they were now faced with information from a book they had once dismissed as ancient folklore. But their work wasn't done. At the front of the room, Dr. Lin, a renowned biologist, took a deep breath before reading from the screen. Yes, we did create man from a clay extract. Then we placed him as a drop of fluid in a secure place. Then we made the drop into a clinging clot, then a lump. Then we formed bones and covered the bones with flesh. Then we developed him into another creation. So blessed is Allah, the best of creators. Quran 23:12-14. A heavy silence followed. The scientists carefully studied the passage, comparing it to their knowledge of human embryology. Finally, Dr. Eric Shah spoke, his voice unsteady. This verse describes the stages of fetal development with incredible accuracy. He exhaled slowly. This knowledge was completely unknown until the invention of the microscope, which allowed us to study embryology in detail. Professor Li Wei crossed his arms. Let's compare this to what modern science has discovered. In seconds, they pulled up the latest research on fetal development. One by one, they matched the stages described in the Quran to what embryologists had uncovered. Dr. Eric Shah's hands trembled as he read aloud. In its early stages, the embryo does resemble a blood clot. Then, as it develops, it turns into flesh, followed by the formation of bones. Eventually, the muscles grow around the bones, exactly as the Quran states. Dr. Wong, who had been silently watching, finally spoke. This doesn't make sense. These discoveries were only confirmed in the 20th century. How could they have been written down more than 1,000 years ago? The room felt heavier. The skepticism that once filled the space was fading. What had once seemed impossible was now unfolding before their eyes. But there was more. Forensic scientist Hang quickly typed on his computer, then pointed to another verse. Does man think we will not assemble his bones? Yes. We are able to perfectly restore even his fingertips. Quran 75:3-4. His eyes narrowed. Fingertips. His gaze shifted from his own research to the screen. This verse doesn't just mention bones, it emphasizes the uniqueness of fingerprints. He gestured toward an image of fingerprints. We now know that every human has a unique fingerprint pattern. Even identical twins have different ones, and today fingerprints are a key part of forensic science. The weight of realization pressed down on the room. What they had set out to challenge had instead challenged them. A magnified comparison of fingerprint patterns flashed across the screen. Suddenly, a wave of realization hit the room. Dr. Wong leaned back in his chair, his voice barely a whisper. How is this even possible? No one had an answer. Professor Liwei took a deep breath. We started this study to challenge the Quran's scientific claims, but every statement we've examined so far aligns with modern science. The atmosphere shifted. Disbelief and tension filled the air. Some scientists sat frozen as if their entire understanding of the world had been shattered. Dr. Wong finally spoke again. If this had happened once or twice, we could call it coincidence. But this keeps happening. Again and again. A heavy silence settled over the research lab. These were some of the world's top scientists, strong believers in science, skeptical of anything beyond measurable facts. Yet now, they were facing something they couldn't explain. They had dismissed the Quran as an ancient text, yet its verses seemed to reveal truths that modern discoveries were only now confirming. Dr. Eric Shah, the most vocal skeptic, sat motionless, his mind racing, his eyes locked onto the screen. If this is real, if this book truly comes from a divine source, then everything we believed until now has been a lie. No one spoke. The weight of their discovery pressed down on them. Some bowed their heads, overwhelmed. They had spent their lives searching for the universe's secrets, only to find them written in a book long before modern science existed. After what felt like an eternity, Professor Liwei cleared his throat. Our research isn't finished, he said, his voice unsteady. We need to keep going, but I have to admit. He hesitated. I don't think we're just studying a book anymore. No one argued. Something had changed, something deep. Then a new verse appeared on the screen. He has created a barrier that prevents them from crossing, and he has set the two seas in motion, one salty and bitter, the other fresh and sweet. Quran 25:53. Dr. Wong, an oceanographer, stepped closer, his eyes scanning the words. This describes two bodies of water meeting, but never fully mixing. Professor Liwei nodded. Islamic teachings say there are places where fresh and salt water flow side by side, yet remain separate. The room remained silent. The evidence was right in front of them, and for the first time they weren't sure what to believe anymore. A growing sense of amazement replaced the skepticism among the scientists. They exchanged glances, struggling to grasp what they were witnessing. Scientifically, this should have been impossible. Water should mix when it comes into contact. And yet, modern oceanographic studies had uncovered something shocking. This phenomenon was real. Dr. Huan displayed satellite images of the Amazon River meeting the Atlantic Ocean and the Strait of Gibraltar. We've confirmed that due to differences in salinity and density, these waters remain distinct. The room was silent. The evidence was undeniable. Dr. Chin, who had dismissed earlier findings, now looked uneasy. His voice barely rose above a whisper. But this couldn't have been seen with the naked eye. There were no tools at the time to detect such things. No one had an answer. A sobering realization settled over them. Professor Liwei exhaled sharply. Let's move to the next phenomenon. He tapped his iPad. The screen changed, revealing another verse. And in the sea, there is a blazing fire. Quran 52:6. Dr. Chin, a volcanology expert, tensed. His throat tightened as he muttered, I know about this underwater volcanoes. All eyes turned to him. Lava, thousands of degrees in temperature, erupts from massive fissures in the Earth's crust at the ocean floor, he explained. Logically, the seawater should extinguish the fire, but due to extreme pressure, it keeps burning. His hands shook as he pulled up footage from deep-sea explorations. The screen filled with eerie images of molten lava spilling from the ocean floor, illuminating the darkness with a ghostly glow. The room was frozen. Another phenomenon, only recently discovered by modern science, was already described in the Quran. This was no longer a coincidence. On the screen, fire blazed beneath the ocean's surface. A 7th century person could never have imagined such a thing. The weight of realization pressed down on them. A whisper broke the silence. This is real. Many of them, scientists, skeptics, atheists, had come into this study expecting to dismiss the Quran's claims as ancient myths. But now, confronted with undeniable proof, their beliefs were unraveling. Dr. Eric bowed his head. His voice was barely audible. If this is true, then we've been living in ignorance. Professor Li Wei, usually sharp and skeptical, now had tears in his eyes. He had spent his life believing that science alone could unlock the mysteries of the universe, but now he stood at the edge of something far greater than he had ever imagined. I don't know what to say, he admitted. I thought science had all the answers, but this is beyond our understanding. A heavy silence settled over them. Finally, Dr. Wong spoke, his voice trembling. I want to learn more about Islam. With amazement in their eyes, everyone stared at him. One by one, the others began nodding. Me too, Dr. Wong finally said. Dr. Michael took a deep breath. I can't ignore this anymore. What started as a simple study of an old book had turned into a journey of self-discovery. The very scientists who once doubted everything beyond logic now found themselves questioning their own beliefs. And then, inside that high-tech research center, surrounded by screens flashing scientific data from around the world, they spoke words they never thought they would say. I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and I bear witness that Muhammad is his messenger. The room filled with emotion, but their tears weren't from sadness. They came from the overwhelming realization that they had discovered something deeper than science. Something beyond reason and logic had unfolded in that state-of-the-art lab in China. A light had entered their hearts. The next morning, everything felt different. The usual sounds of keyboards clicking and heated scientific debates had been replaced by a deep, thoughtful silence. The researchers, once dedicated only to facts and theories, now sat in quiet reflection, pondering something far greater than their work. Professor Lue stood by the wide glass window, gazing at the city skyline. In the distance, the faint call to prayer echoed through the air. If the Quran truly holds the answers we've found, he murmured, what does that mean for our lives? He turned to his colleagues, searching their faces. Finally, he spoke the words they had all been afraid to say. We have to admit, we were blind to something greater. Dr. Arya sighed, nodding slowly. I never thought I'd say this, but I feel the same. Dr. Cav wiped away a tear. So do I, he whispered. One by one, the others nodded. Their discovery was no longer just about science. It was about truth, about purpose. The very atmosphere in the lab had shifted. These were scientists who had once dismissed faith as mere myth. Now they stood at the edge of a profound realization. At last, Dr. Wong spoke, his voice filled with emotion. For years, I denied the existence of God. I thought faith was just a story people told themselves. But now, his voice wavered. Now I see the truth. Silence fell over the room. Then, one scientist finally asked the question that hung in the air. How can we go back to our old lives after everything we've uncovered? And at that moment they knew this was more than just a breakthrough. This was the beginning of something much greater. They looked at each other, as if waiting for someone to take the first step. Then, one by one, their voices rose in unity. I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and I bear witness that Muhammad is his messenger. As the weight of their words settled in, tears of joy streamed down their faces. They had set out to challenge an ancient text, only to find an undeniable truth. In the days that followed, the research center became more than a place of scientific study. It transformed into a space of learning, reflection, and change. The Quran was no longer just a book to analyze. It has become a guide for life. Scientists who had once lived by numbers and calculations now set aside time to pray, to understand, to find peace unlike anything they had ever known. Professor Leeway, a man who had once put his trust only in physics, now often sat in his laboratory, staring through his telescope at the vast universe. But the stars and galaxies no longer seemed random to him. One evening, as he looked up at the sky, he whispered to himself, "There's a miracle behind everything, a creator who controls every second of existence." And in a place once ruled by logic and statistics, a new light shined. It illuminated hearts that had once been lost in doubt. They were no longer just seekers of knowledge, they were seekers of truth.